Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Gregory Pfeiffer, and I am the Executive Director of the Institute of Current World Affairs. Thank you all so much for joining us to hear our returning fellow, James Courtright, talk about his 2 years reporting across West Africa about Fulani societies and what their challenges have to say about politics, economies, and the roots of violence in the region. And he'll then join a stellar expert panel to broaden the discussion. And I should also say we have an online audience joining us by Zoom as well, so thank you all for joining. You don't need me to tell you that there is mounting instability around the world as 20th century security arrangements are being increasingly challenged. Or that among the regions geopolitics are transforming fastest is precisely West Africa. Earlier this year, 3 of its countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, declared their withdrawal from ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, the region's main bloc, and despite its shortcomings, a force for stability and democracy. That's just one of the latest developments since a series of recent military coups toppled governments across the region. The new leaders have broken promises to hold elections and increasingly turned to Russia and China for support. The former colonial power, France, blamed for mounting jihadism, has been all but pushed out of the region. And the United States, too, withdrew its counter-terrorist special forces from Niger last month, while hopes for democracy are receding. That, of course, means that our need for expertise in the region is perhaps greater than ever, and it's precisely what James has been acquiring during a highly illuminating 2 years embedded deep in the field. Examining society and politics largely through the views of Fulani societies, the world's largest pastoralist group, he's looked at how they're responding to climate change, discriminatory governments, increasing jihadist activity, and what it reveals about larger issues. And he's made it very clear that many Western countries, aid groups, and development institutions are floundering by perceiving what's going on through stereotypes more often than not. Examining daily life at the most local levels, James urges not imposing foreign and sometimes ruinous demands and conditions, but looking to what's worked for many years in traditional societies and traditional economies. He's well qualified to do that. James grew up between East Africa and the United States. He holds a bachelor's degree from Denison University and a master's from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. He served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal, written for NPR, Rose and Kingdoms, and other outlets, and worked with Gambian civil society for the country's Truth Commission. Since having finished his ICWA fellowship last December, James has remained at his base in Senegal, from where he's working with the Dutch think tank Clingendael, if I have the pronunciation correct, where he's working to research jihadist insurgent infiltration in northern Ghana. And he's also working on another project on northern Ghana, spearheaded by the British High Commission in Accra. Before we hear from James about his fellowship, I'd like to say just a few words about the Institute of Current World Affairs. We send outstanding young professionals abroad around the world on 2-year independent writing fellowships to acquire deep understanding of global societies. Our fellows become leading experts on international cultures and affairs. And our alumni include one of our other panelists today, Hannah Armstrong, who was also a fellow in West Africa about a decade ago. Now a writer and an advisor on peace and security in the region, her expertise is highly in demand, and she also happens to be James's partner. So today's panel is in excellent hands, and it's a very distinguished group indeed. But before the conversation with the panel, James will speak about his on-the-ground experiences, as you know, and we'll have a Q&A with the audience after the panel discussion with you, the audience. And with that, I welcome James.
Thank you very much, Greg, for that very nice introduction. With ICWA, I had this very broad fellowship where I got to spend 2 years traveling around West Africa, researching and writing about challenges facing Fulani societies. So to begin with, for a little bit of context, the Fulani, who in French are known as Peul, in English Fulani, and in their languages as Fulbe, are an ethnic group of around 30 million people who live all the way across West Africa from Senegal to Sudan, which is around the same distance as from New York to California. They are united by a group of languages known as either Pular or Fulfulde. Most Fulani, not all, but the vast majority are Muslim. And maybe most importantly, they all share this history of coming from a background of at one point their ancestors being semi-nomadic pastoralists. At the same time, Fulani are divided among at least 17 different countries, around a dozen linguistic and cultural subgroups. In some areas, there's still vestiges of a caste system where you have elites on top, artisans in the middle, and formerly enslaved people on the bottom, as well as herders. But this differs across the region. In some places like northern Guinea or central Mali or northern Burkina Faso, those vestiges are still more salient. In other places, less so. Fulani are often associated with herding livestock, but in reality, there are far more Fulani farmers than herders, even though that's not really how they're thought about today. And then in other places, like in Guinea, Fulani are actually mostly traders and commerçants. There's this huge trade diaspora that exists from Mauritania to Liberia that is run mostly by Fulani from Guinea. So considering this broad diversity of experiences, throughout my 2 years, instead of trying to kind of come up with any broad general conclusion about Fulani society, I tried to each month look into a different facet of Fulani life, Fulani societies in different countries, and try to capture some of that diversity. But at the same time, there were, of course, cross-cutting themes. And so one of the things I want to talk about here today is this issue of quote-unquote farmer-herder conflicts. And so what I mean by that is across the region, you have kind of altercations that will often begin on an individual level that then escalate to a communal level. And it all starts with some livestock going into somebody's field and eating the crops and the farmer getting angry, or in the other case, maybe some farmers killing some livestock that are straying a little bit too close to their field. In some places, like in southern Senegal, where I did my Peace Corps service, it won't escalate beyond some harsh words, and there'll maybe be a little payment of compensation. In other places, like in central Nigeria today, it'll escalate into a case of these retaliatory violence that will claim hundreds of lives. So today I'm going to start by talking about how I've actually really come to dislike this term, farmer-herder conflict. And then I want to get deeper into, so what is actually driving this violence? And then I'll end by discussing some of the solutions that I saw over my 2 years as an ICWA fellow. So these altercations were something that came up throughout all of the countries that I was able to visit with ICWA. But the more time that I spent talking with the actual participants, the people who are actually affected and participate in these conflicts, the more I started to see this big difference between how they were experiencing what was happening and how it was discussed in the media, by NGOs, by governments, and even by some scholars and researchers. And I came to really dislike this framing of farmer-herder conflicts, because the thing is that words really matter. And so how we talk about and how we think about this violence, it's really going to shape the kind of solutions that are proposed. So the first thing that's important to say is that farmer and herder are not mutually exclusive categories. Many of the herders, people who are described as herders, they also farm during the rainy season, and many of the people who are farmers keep livestock. While people often say herder as a code word for Fulani, Fulani are not the only people who are herders across West Africa. And as I mentioned, there are actually far more Fulani farmers than there are herders. So I think this kind of reductive, putting people into these categories, can be really problematic. Furthermore, putting all farmers in one kind of faction and all herders in another faction, it makes it seem like all farmers are somehow cooperating and are all united together, and all herders are somehow cooperating and are all united together and coordinating their actions. And when you start to see it like that, when you think like, oh, all the herders are working together, then you have these if I can just say, ridiculous things. Like in 2015, the Global Terrorism Index labeled Fulani militias as the 4th most deadly terrorist group in the world, which is just frankly completely not true. But it's based on this assumption that somehow all Fulani in Nigeria are working together and are coordinating their actions. And so when I was in Nigeria with ICWA, I was in a small rural community speaking with some Fulani herders who are both victims and perpetrators of some of this violence. And I asked them, I said, listen, like there's the kind of claim that you're part of this that you're getting your orders from on top and that you're part of this huge conspiracy. And they laughed in my face. When I asked, how do you respond to those allegations? And they laughed in my face saying, that's ludicrous. Like, yes, we do have issues with the neighboring Bwatwe community who are mostly Christian and who are farmers. However, we also have huge issues with other Fulani communities, and we fight with them just as much as we do other people who are farmers. And those people in Abuja who claim to represent us, the head of these Fulani associations, they don't represent us at all. And so we have just as many issues with other Fulani as we do with these farmers. But when you start to say, oh, all Fulani are united, then you have an attack in one part of the country that's perpetrated by herders, and in another part of the country they say, oh, your brothers are attacking us over there, and it legitimizes violence against Fulani in other places. So it's this incredibly problematic and dangerous framing. And then the last issue on this framing that I think is really dangerous is that it makes the conflict, it boils down the conflict to people's livelihoods. It makes it seem like farming and herding are the problem, and that whenever there's a farmer and a herder next to each other, violence is inevitable, and there's no way that people can share land. But the fact of the matter is that is not borne out by the evidence at all. There is a long history across West Africa of farmers and herders having these very peaceful, symbiotic relationships. Farmers like it when herders come to their area for a couple months every year because the livestock leaves manure, and then when the rainy season comes, that is a great place to sow your crops. And herders also, they like to come to places where people have been farming because they leave the stubs of the sorghum and the millet, and that's great fodder for livestock. And so there are a lot of places where you have there's more examples, I think, of peaceful collaboration between farmers and herders than there is of violence. But that's not what makes the news, obviously. So, I find this framing sometimes to be reductive and, frankly dangerous, and often weaponized against certain communities. But the fact of the matter is that there is violence that occurs often when a cow wanders into somebody's field or when somebody kills livestock. And I don't really like to I think some of the data around this is really problematic, but there is a perception, and I think it is the reality, that over the last 10, 15 years there has been an escalation of this violence across the region. But based on my 2 years with ICWA, the culprit, it's not ethnicity, it's not the livelihood, but it's deeper problems to do with governance. And so in the past, there used to be agreed upon places where like this part of the land for these months out of the year is reserved for farmers, this part of the land is reserved for these months out of the year for herders. But this is kind of, these communal relations have really crumbled over the last couple decades, partly because of the expansion of agriculture. Obviously, these countries need to feed themselves. And with improved technology, all of a sudden with motor pumps and irrigation, farmers can now farm in areas they didn't used to be able to farm. So that is encroaching onto land that herders used to use. At the same time, you have drought in the Sahel, you have erratic rainfall, and you have conflict in the Sahel that's pushing herders further and further south into parts of West Africa that they didn't used to go to. So for instance, a few months ago, I was in central Ghana in the Savannah region, and you have hundreds, probably thousands of Fulani from Burkina Faso who are fleeing the conflict there, who've arrived in central Ghana, and it's starting to create problems because the people who live in that area they don't have these long-standing relationships with Fulani. And so all of a sudden there's all these people are coming further south, encroaching on their fields, and it's causing conflict. Beyond that, and this next one, so basically this crumbling of these land sharing agreements is really essential, I think, to understanding this violence. At the same time, and this differs from country to country, there's deep-seated impunity and a lack of justice. So for instance, on a trip to the region of Kolda in southern Senegal, I remember speaking with this farmer who was complaining about how herders had come and trampled his fields and destroyed his crop. And he talked to me about how he got into an altercation with these herders and he pulled out a gun and the herders ran away. But about 45 minutes later, the gendarme, the authorities, came to his hut in this small little village way on a little dirt road and said, "Hey, we heard you had a gun. Like, do you have a license and registration for that?" And so actually the gun was a fake gun. That's another story. But my takeaway was like, wow, I can't believe that the gendarmes showed up out here on the border of border of Guinea-Bissau because they heard that there was a weapon. You know, you contrast that with the small town of Numan in eastern Nigeria, where in 2017, over the space of 2 months, you had the Boatwe community and the Fulani community who were arming, committing raids against each other, and in cases committing massacres against each other, hundreds of people being killed, and the police and the military did absolutely nothing. They never intervened. They only intervened during a Fulani attack on a Boatwe community, and the Nigerian Air Force came in and bombed the Boatwe community, and bombed this Boatwe village, leading to dozens of extra deaths. And now the Boatwe think that the government is somehow working with the Fulani. So, you know, speaking with both sides, they both said, listen, if the government had intervened earlier, hundreds of lives would have been saved. But when the authorities fail to intervene, communities take justice into their own hands, and more often than not, this leads to further violence. The last thing I think that's kind of driving some of this violence across the region is the theme of marginalization. And so this is occurring on a national context, the marginalization of Fulani, and then also within Fulani societies, there's a marginalization of herders specifically. So again, this differs place to place, but within the coastal states, and I'm talking here about Benin, Togo, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Fulani are really considered foreigners, even when they've lived there for hundreds of years. So for instance, in Benin, where the government is attempting to settle herders, to sedentarize them, some of the biggest pushback they're getting on that is from farming communities who say, hey, why are you giving all this land to foreigners, when in fact these Fulani have lived there for a long time. In other countries, such as Mali and Burkina Faso, Fulani aren't thought of as foreigners, but they're very underrepresented in the government. And so issues of pastoralism and cattle rearing, it's not a government priority. Even when there have been projects that have been done for herders, for instance, in the 60s and 70s, they dug all these wells in central Mali that were meant for pastoralists. Within a decade, these farming communities moved around the wells and started farming around the wells, and the herders had nobody to go to advocate for their position. And so now there's been a lot of communal conflict in this place of Mali over access to wells. So at the same time, there's also this kind of fracturing that's happened within Fulani societies. So as I mentioned earlier, certain Fulani societies can be very divided by basically the vestiges of this caste system. And there's real tensions between the elites and the formerly enslaved communities, or even between elites, and rural herders. And the herders often feel like the elites who used to represent them no longer do that. So for instance, in central Mali, there used to be kinship relations between settled Fulani in the towns of Mopti and other urban areas, and these nomadic herders who moved with the rains seasonally. But after independence, the settled Fulani in the towns joined the government, and they kind of cut the herders off. And so it used to be in the past that the herders could go to the settled elite and say, listen, it's been a rough season, can we have some food and some water and some milk? And they would provide that. But those relationships no longer exist. And this crisis within Fulani societies has kind of led to this opening where you have more extremist figures have attempted to seize the mantle of community leadership. And that's just leading to more fracturing and marginalization. So if natural resource management, impunity, and marginalization are the real drivers of this violence, what are the solutions? And so a good example, and I will admit that I am somewhat biased here, would be to look to a country like Senegal, where since independence, the government has created and maintained pastoral reserves that farmers are not allowed to farm there. These are spaces that are exclusively for herders. And what's important there is that they've maintained that, because Nigeria tried to do the same thing. They set aside these grazing reserves right after independence, but they weren't maintained. And now these reserves are full of fields and farms, and every year there's horrific violence that happens in these places because herders say, hey, this land is legally set aside for us. The farmers say, too bad, we're farming it now, what are you going to do about it? So between grazing reserves, you also need to have kind of what are called usually livestock corridors. And so for instance, in southern Mauritania, there have been some projects that have worked with farming and herding communities to set up to get together and set up this corridor here is going to be for livestock. So farmers, you're not allowed to plant your crops here. And they also build wells on the outside of farming villages. And it's the responsibility of the farmers to maintain the well. But at the same time, herders who pass through, they pay the equivalent of like 5 cents to use the well. And so it's in the interests of farming communities to maintain the wells and to maintain these livestock corridors. And it's in the interests of herders to work with the farmers to make sure that they can use this space every year. And so even though you have, climate change, you're close to the border of Mali where the security situation is quite dire, you don't see as much conflict in those places because of these projects bringing people together. But the fact of the matter is that those projects take a long time to build, and that you need to have governments who are open to working with Fulani and who see Fulani as part of the national fabric, which is sometimes easier said than done. And it was also a lot easier for the government of Senegal to set aside big tracts of land in 1960 than it is in 2024, because those places are now populated. But in the meantime, there are some kind of shorter term projects that I got to go and visit and speak to people about during my ICWA fellowship. So one of them is in Ghana, where there's a project that brings together on a very small local level Fulani and non-Fulani communities. And they bring them together first and just discuss what are your problems with each other. And the first few days get a little bit heated, but then after that they often find that they're actually suffering from the same problems of corrupt local governance, climate change, and kind of what they would describe as bad eggs in each other's community who are spoiling the name of the whole community. And so after these dialogues, they form mediation committees who are nominated by the communities, and their responsibility is to adjudicate problems of crop damage and livestock killing. And so I went to this small village of Sori No. 1 in the Savannah region, and I spoke with people who described the scenario where a farmer claimed that his field had been destroyed and that he had been beaten within an inch of his life. He called into town and said, "The Fulani have attacked me, I'm near death, and they destroyed my field." And a group of young men in Sori No. 1 got together and they said, "All right, we're going to go burn down the Fulani hamlet. We've had enough of this." But this mediation team intercepted this group on the way to the Fulani hamlet and said, whoa, to try to de-escalate the situation, saying, listen, if you attack this, you will become the perpetrators, and there'll be no compensation, no justice for anybody. That's number one. Number two, do you actually know what happened in the field? Before you go and attack the Fulani hamlet, let's go check out the guy's field. And so they showed up at the field, and the extent of the crop damage was not nearly as much as he had said. And yeah, he'd broken his thumb in a fight with a Fulani herder, but he wasn't, within an inch of his life. And so the kind of crowd calmed down and went back to their houses, and the situation was de-escalated. And that's, thanks to this mediation committee that went in and intervened. And so the project isn't perfect, but it has its problems, but I think it's a good start to trying to address some of these issues. So yeah, as Greg mentioned, since I finished my fellowship in December, I've continued working on these issues. I recently conducted a survey of livestock markets across Ghana, the point of which is to kind of try to look at how the place of Fulani in Ghana's livestock markets, and then look at how do these livestock markets contribute to Ghanaian society, looking at how they contribute to tax bases, how they contribute to employment, social cohesion, and food security. And the point is just to try to highlight positive Fulani contributions to Ghanaian society. I'm also an associate researcher with the Clingendael Institute, and we're currently working on a project looking at political polarization in the lead up to Ghana's elections, and looking at how that's escalating community tensions in border regions of Burkina Faso. So I really want to end my talk here by thanking ICWA, particularly Greg and Bruce, for all of the support over the last 2 years. It would not have been possible without them. I'm very keen to keep working on these issues and keep working on these challenges. I want to thank my parents and my brother for listening to me for the past 10 plus years as I've discussed these things. I also want to thank my very supportive partner, Hannah Armstrong, for everything that she's done and all the support she's given. And lastly, I really want to thank the people of Golda, where I did my Peace Corps service. The people who taught me the Pular language, who taught me everything that I know about Pulaku. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. And especially the people who have talked to me over the past 2 years as I've barged into their life, asking all of these very intrusive questions and have put up with me. So thank you to everybody. Onjarama, mieti on Sunday. Thank you very much, and I'm excited for this panel that we're about to have.
James, thank you very much for that. Before we get to our discussion, I would like to introduce our very distinguished panelists. Abdoul Salam Bello is Executive Director of the Africa Group 2 at the World Bank Group Board of Directors. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. He's an expert in economic development, multilateral trade cooperation, and diplomacy. He was previously Senior Project Officer at the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, leading a land restoration program in the Sahel. And he's written 2 books on Africa, including on relations with the United States. Hannah Rae Armstrong is a writer and advisor on peace and security, as I've mentioned, in the Sahel, Maghreb, and Western Sahara. She was previously a senior consulting analyst for the International Crisis Group and a Fulbright Fellow in Mexico. Mexico, sorry, Morocco. No, yes, I'm going to say it's Friday, my brain is mushy, but I have no excuses. And she's also written for the International New York Times, the New Republic, and the Financial Times. And I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator, Catherine Rielly, who is an ICWA trustee and president and executive director of Rubia, an NGO that promotes women's economic empowerment, education, and health in Mali, Afghanistan, and Palestine. A political economist, she has taught policy analysis, refugee and gender issues, and also advised the governments of Mali, Zambia, and the United States, and done comparative research on policy in over 20 countries. So with that, handing over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Greg. And I want to start by congratulating James on his outstanding talk and on being able to share with us your next phase, which is to use and leverage what you've learned on your fellowship to shed light on the real conditions of the Fulani in order to help them decrease the marginalization. And it's very impressive. So what I'd like to do is start by asking both Abdoul Salam and Hannah to comment on the proposed solutions, the case of Senegal, the better governance, and then Ghana, and if there are any particular factors which you'd like to emphasize that you believe will contribute to peaceful coexistence among Fulani and among other groups and individuals in the Sahel. Abdoul?
Okay. So thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine. But special thanks really and congratulations to James. I really appreciate this presentation. Something he didn't tell you that he's actually fluent in Fulani, so which makes his life also made his life also quite easier in connecting with the various groups there. I had a point to have a few words with him. I can confirm he's fluent in Fulani. so great job, my friend. I appreciate everything that has been said, which I definitely share from what I've observed, myself being also Fulani, lived in the region, but also under my capacity in international institutions, how we address also inclusion, various groups, fragility, conflict in the context of increased demographics, climate change, etc. One critical point I think is that came out from what James said is really the issue of governance and the role of the institutions, leaders, local leaders. The representation, in most cases what we observe is very few lack of representation, and those who are supposed to represent, sometimes they are not doing the right job. So this dimension, I believe, is very critical in that chapter. Catherine, you asked what kind of examples. I like the example of Senegal, definitely defining also space for grazing, for access to land. That it speaks also to which extent the states is organized, committed, strong enough to ensure proper governance of the land, of the natural resources, but also of the population that are moving around. So the issue of access, I think, will remain critical. The importance of the social contract will remain also critical. Some elements also is the point will be how to make sure the various groups that coexist, Fulanis and others, also have a way, there is a social fabric where they can coexist one way or another. I can give an example, for instance, in Niger, we have this approach, we call it in French, parenté à plaisanterie. So like cousins joking, cousins teasing each other, based on various cultural groups. This approach helps also diffuse or make, at least avoid having conflicts between specific groups. If you are cousinly quote-unquote related to each other, you going into conflicts is even kind of you losing face or not respecting the cultural and the social environment. But of course, unfortunately, sometimes those conflicts happen. So we need to look at all the elements that exist to make sure that we can ensure a proper coexistence. But once again, really, the proper coexistence will speak to governance, leadership, but also opportunities for those also who are still herders. We're not, and how they're seen. In most cases, they are seen also like disenfranchised. Maybe the last one, and they explained it very well. I mean, in the social chain. So they're somehow at the last. So they're in the peripheries of the cities, etc. So how also to make sure that even their, not only their identity but their dignity is also properly reflected, but also they have also the sense of respect, but also once again access to services. Services starting, I would say, even from documentation. To give the example of access to land, where in some countries they can say, okay, but those are foreigners. How can you prove your identity? You don't have an ID. So those elements also remain critical. That's why when you talk about the social contract, it's also the sense of belonging, not only to a society, but also to a country per se. So those elements, I think, will be also going forward quite important. And last point is, of course, we talk about ECOWAS. So it's a regional economic community, free movements of people, to some extent theoretically, and in some cases, how to make sure that also those who can cross the border, not having the documentation, of course with the livestock, etc. And then last point will be those who are always on the movement. What kind of solution the community, the state can give, especially for the younger one, the kids, in terms of access to education, access to health, in addition to the documentation. In some countries, in Niger, remember there were these things that are called nomadic classes, which accompany or is part of those groups that are moving. It's not only Fulanis, but all the nomadic groups, and exactly as you mentioned, it can be the Arab, the Tubu, the Tuaregs, among others. So I would say that through your assessment, your report, we can really look at it on how to address social inclusion, access, development to not only the Fulanis, the herdsmen, but also really all the nomadic in that. And we have seen somehow how lack of inclusion led also not only to conflicts among the communities, but also at a medium or higher level in the region. That's what we really want to avoid, and you mentioned the situation in the region, so we don't want to add also those issues. I will stop here, but congratulations again. Very good job, and for my
Which is great. So just one comment, piece of information, which is that Niger is 189 out of 191, I think, on the Human Development Index. So we're dealing with the situation, which is a weighted average of education, life expectancy, and growth rate. At Mali, I know it because Mali is 188, just above it. So we're dealing, people are living without. So Hannah, now is your opportunity to respond to James's solutions, perhaps propose others. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much, and it's really such a pleasure to be here. I guess one thing I would kind of want to point out is that I think it's really important to look at how efforts to fight terrorism have really worsened existing vulnerabilities. One of the strengths of James's fellowship is that he's really highlighted how some of the dynamics that have really exacerbated violence in the Sahel countries really risk reproducing themselves in the Gulf of Guinea countries, where there are very similar conditions, but these types of conflicts haven't yet emerged. So at a moment when the US is looking to sort of reposition itself and renegotiate its relationships with Sahelian actors, there's this big sort of temptation or trend to sort of pick up the existing security cooperation superstructure and sort of shift it into the coastal countries. And I think that these types of sort of overly militarized approaches to preventing or countering what's referred to as violent extremism often end up becoming a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, where they sort of militarize existing fault lines and instead of avoiding conflict, can create conditions that can lead to outbreaks or escalations of conflict. So I think the significance of really being able to enter into some of these border communities now and look at what sorts of practices are taking place, and at a time when efforts to shift military and security resources into that region is just incredibly significant. And I just want to highlight that I really appreciate that aspect of James's research. And then I guess another point I would add on the issue of sort of solutions, which is a really nice one to focus on, and which, as he mentioned, in Senegal we've had the privilege of being able to see, that these are not necessary conflicts, that they're certain modes of, as he described really well, governance and attention can really kind of head off. These aren't intrinsic or essentialist or necessary by any means. And then I guess one thing that stands out to me, and Abdoul sort of touched on this as well already, is that different central Sahelian countries have different traditions of sort of handling conflict domestically. So it's interesting if you look at how conflict has spread in Mali and is spreading in Burkina Faso. In Niger, there are much stronger traditions of sort of social cohesion and dialogue and kind of integration among different communities. And I think it can be really interesting to kind of look at how, even in terms of sort of moving from, through national dialogue processes in the 90s into, what we're trying to be more decentralized forms of governance. These efforts worked better, and I'm getting a little wonky here, but sort of worked better in Niger than they did in Mali, for instance, and a lot of the seeds of the current conflict that we're seeing can be traced to those traditions and those practices. So it's good to kind of think about how things aren't perfect in Niger, but the insecurity is really largely contained to sort of border zones, and there's traditions of inclusion and social cohesion that demonstrate that these things can be done and these grievances can be addressed, but it really relies on thinking about them in terms of sort of political rationality. And unfortunately, the language of the war on terror is sort of the precise opposite of that. So that just kind of gets back to the need to sort of really think through counter-terror policies in moving forward, in terms of U.S. policy in West Africa.
Yeah, that is very important. And I remember having a debate about why Niger has the lowest rate of COVID-19. And we were trying to, and I'm talking to a friend who runs an organization that works in Niger, and we came down to this conclusion that it's the social cohesion, the connection between people, the dense social capital, in contrast to not just West Africa, but the rest of the world. So that is very important. So we have governance and leadership is one factor, and then social cohesion, sort of existence of social capital in Niger, not so much in Burkina and Mali. So I wanted to pick up on your comment about the countering violent extremism, which I associate with the State Department's program, but there are many other donor programs countering violent extremism, and it is reminiscent of the donors making things worse in international development. That's what it reminds me of. So could you both, in the past, right, comment on the relationship between West African leaders and the West? So, you've already mentioned that they sent the French home, and I love in your newsletter you have these details, like the French told the Burkinabe that Air France could no longer fly in, and they just found that very haughty and offensive, and I can understand that. So the changing relations, the role of China, Russia, even UAE, Middle East as we get out, looking at Sudan as the UAE is funding the Sudanese war. It's over, but there's only one country, right, between Sudan and Niger, and that's Chad. So, Abdoul, allez-y.
Okay, no, thank you. Very easy questions. No, I think I support what also Hannah mentioned on her assessment. I think those are very important. How to look at the role of other actors. Looking at the international community, of course, we're in a specific geopolitical juncture, so making a definitive assessment will be quite difficult. But since you pointed on the international community, and I have my friend from the World Bank somewhere, so I don't want them to feel that I'm not defending them. But on more serious note, so international community, they've been working quite a lot, of course, in the Sahel over the last years. We've seen strong engagement in the region in terms of volume of operation, staff deployed in the country, but also topics that have been looked at. One of the topics is about the fragility. We've been discussing how to help address the drivers of fragility, which are euphemisms to say conflict, peace, and security. So the institution, the World Bank, has been working on that. There is an instrument called Prevention and Resilience Allocation that speaks and gives incentivize governments to look at also the political context, social context, among others, but also on the regional level, looking at various programs that can, where you have some commonalities. For instance, women inclusion, program called Sahel Women Empowerment Demographic Dividend, because the demography has an important there, but also equity access for women, but also a program on pastoralism, for instance. Those also exist in the region, implemented at the regional level to regional institutions like the SILS, which is an institution that covers Sahelian countries on droughts, on climate change, but then implemented at the local level. While doing that also, those international communities have been also engaging with the local leaders at the community level. Should it be the traditional chiefs, for instance in Niger, or the religious leaders, among others, especially when it comes to addressing the fragility, but also promoting social cohesion, social inclusion. Of course, there are lessons to be learned there, and to see what worked well and need to be better replicated or scaled up going forward. So this is one dimension I wanted really to touch on. But going forward, also when we observe what is happening in the region, you mentioned the political change in the region, the tension between some countries, or even the institutional organization in the region. I think it's a time also, and I think most of international organizations have been looking at it, what didn't work, what should be done differently and better. And looking at it is the role of the international community somehow. What is the legitimacy of those international institutions today in the region? What is their identity? When I say identity, what role they are providing or they are supposed to provide more, better, differently. And then the importance of capacity. So how they help also the institution or themselves implement their program and project for quicker response on the development agenda. Let's say, for instance, access to water in the rural areas, governance of natural resources, access to energy. If you look at in the region, of course, it's a region where you have the lowest, it's where you have the youngest population, actually. The median age in the region is 15, 16 years.
Do you hear that? 15, 16 is the median age.
So 15, 16 means that half of the population is born 2008, 2009. So, so which means that the importance of the response, the speed for the response is higher than everywhere in the world, but also what approach for the development response. Addressing the issue in the Sahel is not the same as addressing the issue, I would say, in Brazil or in Indonesia. Definitely not. The model is not the same, the population is not the same, so the issue will be what kind of opportunities, skills do we build? And if you mentioned UN Development Index on the region, 189, 188, if you take the Sahel countries, most of them are at the bottom of those indicators. And this UN indicator is about what? It's about education, health, mostly. It's human development indicator. So the point will be how to address them faster. And the last point will be, of course, on gender. I would say girls' education in the region. In Niger, there was a lot of program to help address or accelerate gender education in the country for some time. So I believe that the human capital will remain a fundamental dimension where the international community should be the multilateral development institution or even the bilaterals, where really will be need to look at the human development, well then I will say access to the energy, access to water, going forward. So we have to address all the development issues at the same time, somehow, while addressing the security itself. And before I conclude, if you take the model we all of us have in mind, is a Maslow pyramid. So vertical approach. You have to address first the basic needs, food, shelter, whatever. And then the second level is the security. Then you have third or two, the dignity, which is the last one. But where we are here is mostly circular. You need to address the dignity while addressing the security, while addressing the basic needs. So we need to look at the shifts in that paradigm as well.
Excellent. Hannah, so do you want to kind of shift over to the role of the French, which is one of your areas of expertise in the changing partners, or would you prefer to pick up on investment in young people and capacity human development emphasis going forward, as you like?
Well, I'm happy to speak a little bit on sort of foreign partnerships, which is a really dynamic issue at the present time. It's, there's research to be done on how the increasing partnerships with Russia of the Central Sahel countries put Fulanis at particular risk. So there was a massacre in central Mali of mostly Fulani that was sort of the first real act that Wagner carried out while they were there along with Malian soldiers. And it was just absolutely horrible. And I think elsewhere, I haven't yet seen this as a research lens, but I do think there are ways in which it's important to sort of note the continuity of how Russian security cooperation with Sahel countries in some ways is very similar to how Western security forces cooperated with Sahelian states. So it's a little bit disingenuous for Western actors to sort of come in and say, oh, these Russians with their horrible tactics, because some of them are not that far off from what the U.S. and France were supporting or participating in. But at the same time, certainly the training wheels are off, the safeguards are off, and there's a lot more potential for damage right now in the partnership between Sahelian military leaders and Russian security forces, which is strongest in Mali, sort of underway in Burkina, and seems to be materializing in Niger as well. I think there is a particular risk for Fulani communities that's to be sort of looked out for. In terms of the the relationships with France and the U.S., there has been a sort of round rejection of the French diplomats and security forces just solidly expelled from the countries. The U.S. is in a different situation. You know, I haven't seen a lot of good analysis yet of sort of the precise position that the U.S. is in the Sahel, which is really tricky because it, you know, it doesn't really have the tensions or acrimony that Sahelian countries have had with France in the past and in recent years, or you know, in some ways the blame that Sahelian countries are sort of projecting onto France for, you know, how badly things had disintegrated after a decade of sort of French-led stabilization initiatives. You know, the U.S. has sort of been involved in these efforts, but in a very kind of quiet or discreet or supportive way. And so now we're at a stage where the U.S. has to sort of determine its own position, you know, having been happy to sort of let France take the lead and make decisions about how the West was going to, you know, collaborate with Sahelian countries. The U.S. is now sort of on its own without France to sort of lead the way. Does this mean, you know, that withdrawal is necessary or even the best policy option? I personally don't think so. I think that there has been some positive engagement in Burkina Faso around, you know, human rights oversight, which is very tricky, and that the U.S. is finding ways to sort of thread the needle of doing that. And I'm also sort of hopeful that, you know, my sense is that the sort of narrative that the U.S. is completely withdrawing from Niger is missing something, and that there are still negotiations taking place. And, you know, that even in terms of sort of popular will, you know, there's more openness towards a continuing U.S. presence in Niger in a way that's, you know, supportive and accepted by the population. But what the terms of that will look like, you know, Niger and Nigerians will have a stronger sort of role in determining. Yeah, and that's, I mean, those are sort of ongoing negotiations, but I do think the U.S. can play a positive role. It's very tricky. It's a very tricky region to be engaged in. You know, there are a lot of dynamics, such as, you know, being in a situation where they might have to partner with forces who are partnering with Russia, or being in a situation where, you know, foreign policy objectives come into conflict with one another, such as not wanting Niger to partner with Iran on certain commercial interests. So, you know, we'll see if it's enough of a priority for Washington to sort of put in that work. You know, the Sahel unfortunately ranks very low in terms of foreign policy priorities for the U.S. But, you know, given sort of how little the U.S. is present there, I think there is some good that they have done and that they can do. So I hope that the resources will be invested in sort of finding that balance and staying in a way that's you know, encouraged and positive. Because also, you know, the relationships are good among Sahelians. I guess the one thing I was going to say is you know, one thing that we sort of don't see is how you know, the war in Palestine sort of colors popular demonstrations against, you know, American military presence in Niger, for example, which is sort of cast as, you know, an outgrowth of anti-French sentiment. But, you know, when I talk to people there, you know, they're sort of saying, you know, we don't want to partner with security forces who are, you know, enabling these types of actions elsewhere in the world.
Well, I would say that was such an answer, because you brought in the issues beyond West Africa to Palestine, and you brought in Iran. And it's important, people probably have heard that Iran has approached and taken, pretty high-level ministers have had visits to Niger, and they've been offered Niger uranium. This is what I've heard. So that could be very, you know, worrying for us and very relevant. And it's interesting, this sort of pan-Muslim solidarity that people of Niger are feeling solidarity with Gaza and their Palestinian brothers and sisters there and in the West Bank. So we haven't talked about, were you raising your hand when you did that? Yeah.
No, maybe I can just quickly reflect on one point, but go ahead.
Okay, so we haven't talked much about climate change, and that's another broad issue that is of interest probably to everybody in this room. So if you could comment on that interaction of climate change with these challenges of governance and with the challenge of maintaining the social fabric going forward with this young population. It's not an easy answer. Abdul, you want to?
I think very briefly on that, definitely climate change is not a surprise or something that we discover in the region. I think the region has always been one of the most affected by the change on the weather, one hand, but most important on the climate going forward. If you look at in even the last 150 years, you have specific periods where you have decades of drought, then which lead to death of livestock, famine, etc. One year period which was in 1910, actually up to 2024 sometime. So it's still in some elders' memory in Niger, but what we know recently is the one in the 50s, and most recently I would say the one in the end of 60s and 70s. And so this one is better documented, I would say, because then you have proper governance system and which helped document, bring some figures, not only in Niger but in most of the Sahel. That's what led the creation even on some of the regional institutions like the SEALs, which oversees the issues of climate change and drought in the region, which was created in the mid-70s.
The SEALs.
SEALs.
S-I-L.
CILSS. Community, I'm not sure if I will spell it completely, but it's an interstate community to fight against climate and drought in the Sahel. So, comité interétatif de lutte contre la sécheresse dans le Sahel, oui, lutte contre la sécheresse dans le Sahel. So this is that specific institution. But when this happened actually in a country like Niger, but not only this period also, you see the link between this climate change, drought, famine, and the change of the institutions at the political level. Most of coup d'etat happened in Sahel were during that period, 70s plus. Niger, 1974, the coup d'etat that happened at that time was directly linked to the issue of ability or inability, among others, of the civilian government to provide response to this specific crisis. But one thing that you observe when they took over at that time, they created a ministry, what I found quite interesting. That ministry's name was Ministry in charge of Rural Economy and Climate Change, 1974.
Wow, ahead of the game.
So it didn't last long, but at least they thought about it at that time. So just to say that, so this dimension of climate change was somewhere in the background in the region. And in some countries, you see them even at that time in the 60s, even working to develop solar energy solution for the region, for access to water, especially in the rural communities, etc. So those dimensions were there. Unfortunately, with some instability, they have not been pursued, so then they fall somewhere into the crowd. So this to give some background about how climate change also has been important in that region since the beginning. But from there, today you take 1960, Niger population 2-3 million people. 62, 64 years later, Niger population 26 plus million people. So between 8 and 9 times increase in some cases. So this is the progress of population you have. So then you have the issue of climate change, then land degradation, change of access of natural resources, weaknesses of the state, then issue of governance and access to natural resources, which to some extent leads to conflict because not enough resources or the reduction of resources, bigger population, bigger needs, I would say, but reduction of what exists. So therefore the governance remains then difficult and that leading to some conflict. That's why we're saying at the beginning, and that's why I like what James was saying. I mean, the issue of leadership, governance, representation, equity, those are also to be linked to what is happening. At the back, we have a report which is called, and I will stop here, It's a new report on climate and development. It's called the CCDR, Country Climate and Development Report. There's one on Sahel and E5 Sahel. And there was an assessment showing the cost of inaction. If nothing is done on that, on the climate agenda, you will have 13.5 million additional people who will fall into extreme poverty by 2050. So this is a magnitude, what we are observing. That's why the importance of speed of the response remains so critical. And to some extent, I believe that's why also you see the in the country, these new governments we have, or even the former one, looking at any other opportunity to address the security on one hand, but also to address the development need, because they're pressing with high magnitude development needs.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad the World Bank is using artificial intelligence for something good to calculate the cost of inaction by doing this economic modeling. That is reassuring, as everyone's talking about the downside of AI. Hannah, would you like to comment on the natural resource issues and dynamics in Niger or in Senegal, as you wish?
Sure. I mean, I think, it's hard to come up with a more dramatic demonstration of people at the front lines of climate change than, herders in areas where the crops just aren't growing anymore and the wells are drying up and they just have to keep moving. So, in addition, farmers also are facing more pressure on natural resources as a consequence of climate change. But because in the Sahel they tend to have better relationships with states, it made it easier for them to seek support or receive different types of support that can help them weather difficult seasons. Whereas with herders, because they have more strained or exclusionary relationships with the states in general, there's a higher level of sort of devastation that's happening on account of climate change. So it's really terrifying. And there are ways herders are finding ways to sort of adapt to these challenges, but the types of loss and devastation are just horrible. I mean, there was a drought in I think 2017 or 2018 that killed a colleague of mine who's worked extensively on it, estimated that tens of thousands of children had lost their lives because of the drought. And it didn't make any headlines, and it wasn't really understood or reported on. So it's not only devastating, but it's also largely invisible. So it's really something to take very seriously. Having said that, I think one trend that we're starting to see is sort of climate change as the perpetrator of a lot of ills, and it kind of lets political actors off the hook to sort of say, it's the resources, there's this kind of natural inevitability about it, and I think it's really important to kind of look at the political actors, and the types of resource management that have taken place and that are taking place, and the problems that are attendant to those types of management. There was a mapping project that sort of, well, maybe I won't name it, but I think it's something that we see more and more is kind of climate change as a convenient vehicle for sort of resuming the ills, and it problematically it really de-emphasizes the political agency that goes into those issues of access to land and water, which means it also obscures the solutions to those problems, which have to pass by political actors. So it's really important. Any discussion of climate change and how it's impacting Fulani or herders or Sahelian societies really needs to look at the patterns of management that governments and donors have practiced and supported, and think about how they can improve.
Right, and I think that underlines the importance of James's research showing that these conditions are inevitable, the natural conditions you have. They're going to exist, this scarcity of land and water, but the responses can be very different as a function of the governance. So let's pay more attention to the governance and not just it's a fait accompli, and so that is to blame. No, that's very important, and you give good examples of that. Are we, yeah, I think we're ready for questions. Congratulations again, James, for an absolutely wonderful presentation. So the questions can be for anyone on the panel, with the emphasis, of course, on our returning fellow, James.
Can you hear me? Is this on?
I don't think so.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I think it's on now. Catherine, thank you very much. Apologies for jumping in and taking the first question, partly because I want to say that for our online audience, please type in your questions in the Q&A chat, and we will try our best to get to them, but cannot make any promises. Thank you for that. So first question, actually, if I may, to James, because you mentioned that, well, and I know that you spent a lot of time traveling. You would go out for weeks at a time and go out into the field, and you mentioned gaining people's trust. So I just wanted to ask you to just sort of describe what it was like being on your fellowship a little bit. How did you travel? How long would you go? Where would you go? On what mode of transportation? But more important, how did you gain people's trust? How did you get people to talk to you about their very personal and existential at the same time problems, and enable you to get a sense of what's going on this grassroots level? Thanks.
Thank you very much for that question, Greg. I think, not to be too short about it, but it was about going back to places. So I would go on my trips were kind of ranged between 2 to 3.5 weeks in a country, and I would usually land in the capital, spend a few days there, and then try to get as rural as was safe to do. So in a place like Burkina Faso or Mali, I wasn't able to leave the capital, but that's why I love going to places like Guinea or Ghana or even Nigeria, where I was really able to go out to rural communities. I think speaking the Pular, so I learned the Pular language, which is one of the kind of Fulani languages in Senegal as a Peace Corps volunteer. So as I mentioned, there's like, 12, at least 12 different linguistic subgroups. So people were able to understand what I was saying. I couldn't always understand everything that other people were saying, but I think even just going in and showing that I've already spent time with Fulani people in another part of the continent really helped people open up. But I honestly, I think the best trips were always the second or third trips to a country, because at that point, on the first trip, it's like, okay, who's this, American dude who's come through? Okay, you speak a little bit of Pular, that's great. We'll never see you again. You're going to go write your report, and I'll never see you again, and it's all over. But then when I would go back the second time, it's like, oh, okay, you weren't just here for a little vacation. Like, you really do care about us, and you came back to say hello, and even to come and greet somebody. A simple act of greeting somebody for a second time really helps people. They open up their doors, and it creates friendships and relationships, and I think, to be honest, I learned a lot of that in the Peace Corps. That's just about building personal relationships with people, and that is what helps kind of facilitate communication and trust. And then people are willing to welcome you into their houses. In terms of travel and transport, it's nice in Ghana. You can fly up to Tamale and then get on what do they call it, a trotro or whatever, and you go out to a rural area, and it's fairly easier to get around. Guinea, on the other chance, you're stuck in it's called a Neuf Place. It's a car for 9 people, and you're stuck there for 17 hours on a really bad road, and that is less than ideal, but that's where you spend the extra $5 and buy 2 places, and it's much more comfortable. I would say it's really like in terms of trying to communicate with people, going back the second time, I found was a way to build relationships that facilitated just good, information exchange.
Absolutely, and I just want to commend you for your courage in going to Mali when it's on all of the lists. Americans can't go, and yet you've gone in there, both of you, at quite great personal risk, and that's what ICWA fellows do. Joe Batat, you have a question.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a question to you, James, and I'm sorry, I'm going to change the subject from what we have done. It's a different topic on the Fulanis. In the course of learning about the Fulanis and living with them and talking to them, how did you learn about the arts, the Fulani art? What kind of arts do they have? Does it differ between different groups of Fulanis? Is it accepted by others? What kind of role that art plays in their daily life? Tell us a little bit whatever you know about it. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you really for asking that question, because I went into my fellow, I wanted to try to kind of, you only ever hear about Fulani society when it's like massacres and stuff, and like, yes, that exists, but there's also this whole other side of Fulani societies that doesn't get discussed. And so speaking about art and like cultural heritage, I think I would look at the position of the griot, as it's usually called in French, the jalibe in the kind of Western Pular languages, but that is, how do you describe a griot? It's somebody who is a very important part of society, whose responsibility is to remember all of the society's history and retell it in the form of epic poetry and epic storytelling. And so actually one of my dispatches in the town of Kolda in southern Senegal, I hung out with some jalibe for a day or two, and they would just describe, and I got a short version of it, which was fine, but they can go for 12 hours of playing the kora and describing in extensive detail events that happened 300 years ago, the personal details of this person's wife did this, and and there is an element of like myth making of it. In the epic of Sunjata, somebody shoots a feather that's made of a chicken feather, and somebody turns to stone in the middle of the river, and it's like, okay, maybe it didn't exactly happen like that, but it is a really beautiful form of remembering and retelling history. And so that is something that I think you do see that I was able to see kind of across the region. Another one, which might not seem quite so obvious at first, but is culinary traditions. And so I did a profile of she's actually Sierra Leonean, part of the bigger Ghanaian Fulani diaspora, born and raised in Freetown, but now lives in Accra, Ghana, and she has a restaurant there, Fatoumata Binta, where she is kind of trying to really valorize Fulani foodways. And so you see, like, there's this kind of cheese that's made in northern Benin, and that also exists in kind of nearby countries called wagache. And she's really trying to bring that to like a global audience. And so that's another way that people are passing down culture, and especially with milk products, because the Fulani are known for their livestock. That's something that is, they're like, people don't drink. I've never seen wagache in Senegal. I mean, maybe it exists, but I've never seen it. But that's something that's like on that side of the Fulani spectrum, if you will. And so that was kind of another form of, and that also, what's interesting about the culinary traditions is that's something that's really among women. The griots, those are mostly men. There are some now women who are griots, but the culinary traditions are something that Fulani women pass on, and it's passed from mother to daughter. And that is a way of kind of identity and saying, like, this is who we are, and this is what makes our society. So those were kind of two examples of different kinds of arts and culture that I had the privilege of experiencing in various parts of West Africa.
Wonderful. Susan?
Oh, is there time for another question?
Oh, you're done, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw your hand.
Just a fast question, because I came in quite late, and I'm sure you did talk about this. Did you see desertification, rapid desertification in the areas where you were? Talking about the aquifers drying up, did you see that having cultural change? What did you actually see during the 2-year period?
Yeah, I mean, I would speak with both farmers and herders, and they would discuss, both, again, Fulani farmers, Fulani herders, everybody would discuss, like, yeah, this land used to be, the forest didn't used to desiccate like this. This used to be pasture land 50 years ago. It's no longer pasture land. I mean, the ways that herders mitigate that is they move. I mean, that's the whole basis of semi-nomadic pastoralism, is when things get really hard in one area, then you change your nomadic patterns. Now that has become much harder in an era of nation states, of firm borders, of discrimination. But that's why I really very much in favor of, at least in West Africa, like, herders need to be able to move across the land, because that's how people deal with these climactic shifts or erratic rainfall that's going on. But yeah, people did often describe, rivers running dry that didn't used to run dry. Pasture land is only green for 2 months out of the year as opposed to 6 months out of the year. So that was something that I heard in communities across the region.
Excellent. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I have one for each. James, we know in the media all around the world, there's usually a bias one way or another. And I've followed your posts and things. Do you think the media that reports on the stories you're talking about are influenced by any political groups or any countries in any way in telling the story? I know in journalism a lot of times people dumb down the nomenclature so people, if the reader has an easier way of picking what side is what, and it's not that simple. So that's your question. And Hannah, I read an article in the Washington Post a couple months ago, I think, where in northern Kenya, where I lived, well, I live in Kenya, I didn't live in the north, but a lot of the cows are dying because of the climate change. And so what the government in Samburu County has done has bought a lot of camels. And then they give the farmers, the herders, a lottery number. And the ones who get the lottery numbers are the ones who've lost the most cows, the most needy. And then they'll say, okay, you're number one, you get Alice. You're number two, you get Johnny. The camels have names. And they're not supposed to kill the camels for meat. They're supposed to, procreate and have bigger herds because they cannot sustain the cows. So is there any of that going on in West Africa?
Okay, yeah, so asking about kind of media bias and whether or not governments are involved in that. The media, there's like the Western media, and then there's also media within these countries, the Senegalese media, the Ghanaian media. And so I guess I'll speak first on the international stage, and actually I wish, I know Hannah has thoughts on this too, but it's very difficult. It can be very difficult to pitch and to get editors to be interested in these very nuanced small stories in what are thought of as out of the way parts of the world. That's one of the beauties of the ICWA Fellowship, is that it allows you to go and write about some small town in northern Ghana that nobody really cares. I mean, people in Ghana really care about it, but people in the United States don't care about it. I don't know if you would, that is kind of a form of bias that people just don't, they consider parts of West Africa just not of interest, even though obviously they are of interest to the people who live there, and there are connections to the United States. On the domestic media front, there is a lot of anti-Fulani discrimination in the media, particularly in Nigeria and Ghana. I see it more in the Anglophone press there. You see this label of Fulani herdsmen are kind of this boogeyman that is used to describe any kind of banditry. And actually there's a lot of, there are a number of Fulani associations in Ghana and Nigeria often complain that if there's some kind of crime that happens, if the perpetrator is Fulani, they'll name the ethnicity of the perpetrator. If the perpetrator is not Fulani, they never name their ethnicity. And so they say, if it's a Dagomba, why don't you name that it's a Dagomba bandit? Or if it's a Yoruba man, why don't you say that they're a Yoruba bandit? You only say when they're Fulani. I don't think that there's any kind of one group or think tank or anything that's trying to push that narrative. I think that is as Abdoul was saying, there's a lack of Fulani in the media, and so and there's this deep-seated discrimination, and so you just kind of, these things compound on top of each other, where there's not someone who's in the editor's room who's going to say, wait, we can't portray it like that. That's not fair to this community, because there's nobody from that community in those positions of power. Yeah, very few. I should say very few people who come from those communities in those positions of power in the media rooms there.
Excellent. And did you want to say something about the substitution of camels for cows or
Sure.
other animals?
I think that's a very interesting idea, and it sounds very, very Kenyan in the sense that there's a lot of support for sort of taking, it's not exactly a technological approach, but it strikes me as sort of a technical approach to the problem, which is good and encourages innovation. In West Africa, so I recently wrote a sort of long form piece looking at efforts to kind of use AI to help stabilize herders, and it ended up being pretty critical of sort of what I call techno-solutionism. The idea that you can use an algorithm and some satellite images to bring stability, and this kind of gets back to a point I was making earlier, which is that the approach is depoliticized, right? It's a fundamentally depoliticized approach. Unfortunately, that type of thinking is increasingly sort of guiding, foreign donors and interventions in some ways, because the politics of partnering with these governments are really, really tricky right now. So it's a way to kind of avoid getting into some of those tricky issues and just saying, oh, well, let's work together on sharing satellite images in ways that can help herders, understand what weather patterns are coming their way, and take measures to anticipate that and ideally protect their herds. But because the political side of that isn't there, the methods of communication or distribution of information aren't as adapted as they could be. So yeah.
That's a very important point, that you can't take politics out of the solution. So I think we have time for one or two more questions. We have our board president.
James?
Yes.
I don't think I need a mic.
Yeah, you're being recorded.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. This is for the recording. James, when we pick an ICWA fellow, we always pick them with an eye to someone who learned the things that fellow wanted to learn, could go on and do wonders. What would you like to be doing 20 years from now, and how might that relate to your fellowship?
In 1 minute. You have one more question. So no pressure there.
20 years is a very long time horizon, so I might kind of look more to the next 5 or 10 years. Right now, we're doing things on a week-by-week basis. But yeah, as new parents. No, I mean, I would like to keep engaging with these issues at a policy level. I would also, I really do believe in this power of stories to expose people to other parts of the world. And so, as difficult as it is to pitch stories about faraway parts of West Africa to an American audience, that's something I would like to keep doing and try to show some of the connections between, America also has serious issues with natural resource management in the west of our country with the Colorado River and you look at the Columbia River and the way that ranchers there are heavily subsidized. And those, it seems like, oh wow, that's really far away from central Mali, but actually there are some similarities there. And so I think that kind of trying to build global solidarity through storytelling is something that I would like to do with my career and my life.
Excellent. Let's take one more question. This gentleman has been very eager to ask his question.
Yeah, Ramanoi.
Yeah, jump in.
There are so many issues that you have touched, but I think the central one, I will add, I'm very educated. I've been to many colleges in this country. I've been here for 51 years. So the point is, what I have observed about what is going on, particularly with the Fulani all across Africa, is this idea of, they are foreigners. This came about, perhaps one young man has written a book, is Dr. Jallo, From Babylon to Marcy, or to Guinea anyway. He touched on these issues that you're touching on, except climate change. Even the Niger was drying 10, 15, 20 years ago. So we never looked at that. But my point is, have you ever examined the role the colonial powers played? I'm not the one to blame anyone. I was born 73 years ago. My parents came from Guinea. They settled in Sierra Leone until in the 60s. Everywhere I went, go back to Guinea. That's what they would tell me. I mean, they have been accustomed to knowing that the Fulanis are just trouble people. They go from place to place, they are nomads, and that is not so. The most educated people now in the entire continent are the Fulanis, including some of the northerners. The Fulanis have produced so much work, and they are enterprising. My dad was a herder, where he had many cows. He never stayed on the warre, if you know what I mean. Well, he was also a diamond dealer. That sent me to this country. Okay, but at the same time, they never looked at the role this colonial powers play. They always said, these people are here to take your land. I was born in Sierra Leone, in Cephalo. I had to take a permit to move about the city. The British had identified us as troublemakers. Can you imagine the trauma it had on me? As a boy, I was born in the city. Everywhere I went, somebody would have to ask me for permit. And I used to shout at the police. I say, don't ask me for permit. You know, ask your so-called. Okay, but
Yes.
these are the things. And then the French, on the other hand, on one side of West Africa, they went to mercy. They destabilized completely tribes. They had, my great-grandfather was an informative. He used to inform the French how the other factions, the Fulani factions, are going, what they are talking about. So he was a traitor.
He was,
killed.
and I thank you very much. This is a
Thank
really
you.
important
Yeah.
intervention. But could we just ask James
Okay.
to comment
So
briefly
your
on
role-
the
your
impact
role
of
on the
colonialism? But
market.
thank you very much. That was an
Thank you.
interesting story.
I'm very happy that you brought this up because it's something that you know, I tried to touch on in some of my dispatches, and as you mentioned, like there's a difference between the French colonial system and the British colonial system, but I think looking at in the entirety, like just this creation of borders as a thing that like you cannot cross this border and you go from one side to the other, you somehow become illegal to be there is obviously a very problematic element in the British. For instance, like in a place like Ghana, when the British got there, they made a big list and they said, these ethnic groups are indigenous to Ghana, these ethnic groups are foreigners to Ghana. And that's still how it works. And that's why Fulani are not, it's only in the last 10, 15 years that people have even started to say, oh, wait a minute, like maybe Fulani should have chiefs because they've actually lived here for 200 years. But that goes back to the British era of them putting people in these categories. Looking at, one thing that I think is very, that doesn't get enough attention is the role that education played in the French colonial system, and the fact that in places like in central Mali, the way that the French came in and kind of destroyed the societies that existed there, and the ways that they had imperfect, nobody's perfect, but they did have ways of mediating conflict between farmers and herders that were immediately destroyed overnight, and then some kind of some bastardized version of it was created, and that is kind of responsible for some of the problems that we see today across the region. So I think it is a very important, it's hard to even begin to discuss the problems of today without looking at where they came from in the past.
No, thank you. That's very useful. So we're going to pass the mic to our executive director, who has a question from the audience, the distant audience from Zoom.
Thank you. So we'll just wrap up with one last question, which is a sort of combined question. Several questions combined into one. You have talked about climate change and population growth, but I wonder if you could talk briefly, maybe starting with you, Abdoul, about your perspectives on population growth over the past 10, 15 years, and links to other challenges that you haven't mentioned, and how much climate change will be exacerbating these challenges. Thank you.
Well, no, thank you very much. Good question. I wanted to reflect on 2-3 things, but I will start with yours. Demographics and climate change, definitely, as we said. So you see the change in nature, access to natural resources. Meanwhile, you have the increase of the population in those countries. Then, where I always advise us to be cautious when we talk about the demographics is in the countries, they don't see that as an issue or a challenge. On the contrary, demographic growth, they see that as a blessing, as they see. People see that as a blessing. So when we come from outside, say, oh, population growth issue, you are asked on which basis? So then when you start to put it in that way in terms of development plan or response, you have a backlash. So the point is how to make sure that the development response goes, I would say, not as fast as, but even faster than the population growth in terms of schools, health, education, health, all those services that need to be provided. While doing so, how also to make sure that there is a strong proper governance of those natural resources and how you anticipate them. The anticipation side sometimes is something that we see missing, even on the way the respective countries engage with any partner, should they be bilateral partner or multilateral partners, how to address or anticipate the climate change on the medium, longer term strategy. Sometimes this doesn't come out quite strong. Rather, it's mostly on specific contextual issue. This year there is a drought, therefore there is a risk of famine, so we need more resources to address it, which is fair. But in terms of longer term response, addressing the cost of inaction, there are some more effort to be done. While there are responses, I mean, for instance, in the Sahel, we talked, I'm sure you heard about it. Especially sometimes it's almost up. But it means that, for instance, in Sahel there is this initiative called the Great Green Wall, which is a long land restoration program to address actually the climate. Okay. So the Great Green Wall initiative for the Sahel.
Green Wall.
So which is a land restoration program that spans from Senegal up to Djibouti, 11 countries across the Sahel, not only the 5 ones we have in West Africa. So it speaks to land restoration, governance of natural resources, bringing energy in the rural area, developing agriculture, access to water, but I would say equally importantly, access to land, importantly for women. In some countries, women access to land is 8%. What is it? 8%.
Not 80, but 8.
No, 8. 0.8. Which, while they are the most farmers, well, they represent the biggest share in the farming sector, where the most of the population lives in the rural area. So those are the issues we think that it's important also to look at in taking into account the demographics and the climate change, how to make sure that those are interconnected. But if you come and say, okay, you have a demographic problem, they'll kick you out. I don't have another way to say that, but that's how it will be. I appreciate what was mentioned on the Fulani history, culture. Just want to, maybe it can be written maybe later on. You have some Fulani authors, at least on the Francophone side. One is, his name is Amadou Ampateba. So Amadou Ampateba is a prominent Fulani historian, intellectual. He made even contribution to the UNESCO book on Africa history, for instance. So he wrote a lot, especially an autobiography regarding his own experience during the French colonial era. And so you see even the colonial system with how it addresses or affected also the existing systems before, even Senegal, some of the war to address or to take over the country. So you see all those narratives very well documented in his books. In addition, even to oral tradition, he wrote about poetry and other things. So I would strongly recommend for those who have some interest in that topic on the cultural history to read someone like Amadou Ampateba or another one called from Guinea called Cherno Manolembo. So who wrote even some books about where some Fulanis have been labeled as terrorists at that time because they were fighting against the colonialism. So you have some food for thought on this time.
And we can definitely send out those specific links. Over to you, Greg.
Can I grab this mic? Sure. Thank you all very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Baby Homer has already made inroads into our panel, so it's good timing to wrap it up. Really, really fascinating. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our audience for coming and for your questions, and our online audience as well. You can read James's dispatches from his 2-year fellowship at www.icwa.org. Thank you.